Thank you, Paul. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a delight to be here with you.
I would like to start with a little bit about your current role at the FDA, which is one of the biggest roles that the agency has, and would like to hear about your goal of bringing data revolution to the agency. How is that going, and what's working, what's not working? Tell us about that.
So I came to the FDA in February of 2019, having been in the health tech industry and thinking that my focus was going to be on real world data, precision medicine, patient centricity. And as I arrived, really ready to jump in and get going and focused on real world data. And I realized that if we were going to advance real world data science and the work of the agency within the context of real world data and the totality of clinical evidence development, we needed to step back and make sure that the agency itself had a robust technical infrastructure and really was ready to deal with the coming revolution of real world data. So approximately 2 months after arriving, I added another job, that as acting chief information officer, and set about identifying and developing a strategy intended to modernize the agency, but also get us ready for this landscape of using data in new ways. In September of 2019, so now almost a year ago, we announced the Technology Modernization Action Plan intended to make sure that we have the right technical foundation and communication points to be a more modern agency and use data in new ways. And then in January of this year, we announced the beginning of our new data modernization strategy, which really took off in a June 30th full day public meeting where we started the conversation around data modernization at the agency. So practically speaking, as I think about my job or jobs, I would say that we're still at the beginning of the journey, that there's still a huge amount to do as it relates to advancing real world data science in service of precision in medicine and patient centricity, but we're laying the foundation and trying to move it forward quickly.
Great. That's a big challenge. And how has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted those goals in a dramatic way? Not so much? Tell us about that.
Inter-COVID-19. So, as I mentioned, we had really started to kick off our data modernization strategy in January. In fact, it was at the Consumer Electronics Show in early January in Las Vegas, where we announced our new data modernization strategy and our intentions. And one of the things I remember saying at that show was that EVALI, so the vaping related illness that we were seeing in the end of 2019, had surfaced how critical it was going to be to use data to quickly manage public health emergencies. The irony is that was January of 2019. We were just starting, January of 2020. We were just starting to learn about a potential new viral syndrome that was being identified in China. And I was scratching my head, was the EVALI scenario a prodrome, so to speak? And in fact, what has really become very clear is that data is a core substrate to addressing COVID-19 and is critical to the agency's mechanisms to address the pandemic. We need better data in order to answer critical questions about what's the natural history of COVID-19, to understand treatment patterns, what medicines are patients receiving, and how does that help us understand both what's happening now and how to better take care of patients in the future. Data to address critical questions like the performance of our emergency use authorizations and do they need to be adjusted. So in fact, that early story of EVALI suggesting the importance of data to help better manage a public health emergency, even though EVALI wasn't fully named a public health emergency, it was actually an important starter that got us thinking about how our new data modernization strategies were going to be important. And now in the context of COVID-19, that is certainly accelerated.
Now, this being a healthcare analytics summit, I think I speak for a lot of my peers when I say that the fight against COVID-19 has had one major keyword, and that's data. And sometimes there's too little of it. Sometimes what is available isn't conclusive. Now, you have been vocal about the importance of creating systems that make it possible for every patient's data to inform decision-making. And I'm someone who subscribes to that point of view. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you score the value of today's real-world data to the mission of the FDA in general? And also then tell us about this issue with COVID-19 in mind specifically.
Oh, I like the scale. So, I think that you've hit on a really critical issue, which is that in order to address the pandemic, we need to use the information that's available to us now, and we need to use it as well as possible. And we also need to reimagine how we're going to use information in the future. So, first of all, you asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are we doing right now? And I'm going to give us a 2. And it's a 2 on execution and a 8 or 9 on vision of where this goes. And the reason why I think it's a 2 right now is because I think that there's so much work to do to understand what data are available. How can we confidently use it? What are the right methods to using it? What are the research questions that we can address right now? What are the research questions we can address next month when we figure out how? And what are the research questions we can address in 6 months when we even get better? And then also, how do we take real world data and partner it with clinical trials data so we have a totality of the evidence approach that we're putting in place for COVID-19? So the only reason I give us a 2 is that I think that we're still in the infancy stage of figuring out how, and that's why we've got to do this quickly in order to advance the space of real world data in service of COVID-19. And I think this will also advance the space of real world data and real world data science writ large.
That's great to hear. So hypothesis generation is at the heart and beginning of basic and applied research and the scientific methods. And in my observation, hypothesis generation in COVID-19 therapeutic space has been chaotic. Vaccine research is much better. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I think the hypothesis generation work has been chaotic, and that's fair. We've been working really fast all around the world, trying to figure out a really complex problem sitting right in front of us. And so indeed, the hypothesis generation has been chaotic and disorganized and really not very planful. And you pointed out that it's been more chaotic in the therapeutic space as opposed to the vaccine space. And that makes sense as well, because when many people are sick right in front of us right now, the most important thing that we're trying to do is provide care for the people sitting right in front of us. And therefore, we haven't had the chance yet to be planful about hypothesis generation or get ourselves organized. And so the observation that it is particularly chaotic in that space is really just a byproduct of, again, the maturity model, how early we are in starting to figure out things and get them done. The observation that the hypothesis generation seems more planful in the vaccine space, I think, is a byproduct of the fact that we've had more chance to sit and reflect and figure out how do we do this well, and how do we move towards figuring out what's the work that we can do, what are the data sets that we've got available to us, how do we make sure that we combine data sets to fill data gaps if we're trying to, for example, describe what's going on with a population of patients and then start to plan clinical trials. That's work that was really built on what was happening in the therapeutic space first.
Amy, do you think there is a space for the FDA to create a process for brokering and prioritizing therapeutic hypotheses that we could then use to drive priorities of data collection and analyses across different organizations?
So I think across the space of the many different governmental agencies, nonprofits, even for-profit organizations, and certainly academia that are working to try and develop approaches for addressing COVID-19, there certainly is the opportunity for more coordination. And we're seeing some of this happen, for example, within the active program at NIH of really trying to be smarter about identifying all the compounds appropriate for study and then whittling down to the highest priority ones to work on first, second, and third. You asked about what's the FDA's role in this. Importantly, we contribute to much of that thinking. But we also have to reflect that we are regulators in this process. So we need to be disconnected enough that when the results of different studies comes to us, we have the opportunity now to make independent observations and judgments based on the information being brought to us. But the beginning part of your question, which is, should there now be more coordination across all the different kinds of studies that are being done and the evaluation of many different compounds and activities? I think that, yes, there should be more coordination. And indeed, we're starting to see more coordination happen. And I would only hope that that gets better and better.
Right. Let me make an assertion here. The pandemic has surfaced gaps that go beyond data, right? And these include interoperability, patient privacy, data rights, and you are covering some of these in the data modernization strategy for the agency. And we have seen millions and billions worth of investment in EHRs with the HITECH Act. We have seen Cures Act implementation that promotes patient access to their electronic health record information and addresses industry-wide information blocking practices. We are still struggling during this pandemic when it comes to data. What are your thoughts on this, and how do we ensure that we are better prepared for the next big crisis?
So my number one headline marquee statement is we have to learn. And you're absolutely right in your assertion that the pandemic has exposed a lot of issues that we need to get better and get right. And I, reflect on many of the things that are happening inside the agency as well as really across society. So some examples. The pandemic has exposed the realities within the context of clinical trials that when patients cannot travel or show up in person for clinical visits, we worry that there's going to be inadequate information about the safety of the medical products being studied in those clinical trials. This is the opportunity to learn how can we partner clinical trials with data coming in from other places and figure out, can we maintain the integrity of the clinical trial data set and also continue to understand safety in the way that we expect to do so as we're studying new drugs and new medical products. And that's the kind of example that COVID-19 and the pandemic has surfaced as a critical challenge that we need to learn from and then take forward into the future. You brought up issues as it relates to privacy. And COVID-19 has highlighted that we all worry about privacy. Interestingly, COVID-19 and the pandemic has happening at the same time we're having big conversations as a nation and as a world around privacy and personal data being held by tech companies. We have GDPR in Europe, et cetera. And so COVID-19 and the pandemic has forced us to think about privacy. And can we start to think about privacy sparing activities that allow us to still use data while maintaining the importance of privacy of personal health information? And so, for example, exploring what does it mean to use synthetic data sets. And this is something the NIH is exploring, multiple tech companies are exploring, and at FDA, we're going to need to start to understand better, because there might be a time now or in the future where these kinds of data sets get brought to us for evaluation as a part of regulation of a product. So I think that COVID-19 is exposing these opportunities. And the number one thing is we need to take this as the opportunity to learn what's possible and then systematically bake in our learnings for the future.
Thank you, Amy. I think that's an important point there because synthetic data is becoming a reality more and more as we go through the pandemic and as technology evolves and our organizations and health systems, health tech organizations evolve in their adoption of technology and also mature in this respect.
Sadiqa, I'd like to respond to that because I think synthetic data is an important example for two reasons. Number one is it's an important example that is a relatively new, it's not completely new, but a relatively new approach to maintaining privacy while also maintaining the core patterns and underlying information within data sets. And maybe a way to do this kind of work in the future at scale. And when I say this kind of work, I mean real world data work. So I see synthetic data as a real opportunity, but it's going to take a lot of work to build the right kinds of understanding of when synthetic data can be credibly used, what are the right methods to use it, and also to build the familiarity and comfort of the appropriate use cases and what it would look like if, for example, it was brought to a regulatory agency. But there's something else about synthetic data. Synthetic data is also a reminder that there are going to be a lot of innovations now and in the future that solve problems for us if we say what the problem is and then let innovation happen. And that is a huge opportunity. We see privacy as an important challenge to be solved so that we can maintain the privacy of our personal information, but also learn from data. Now let's let innovation happen to start to find new solutions to start solving for it.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Amy, we would love to learn more about you, the Amy Abernathy. Many people will be amazed to find out that you, an accomplished technology leader and an oncologist, is someone who spent their teenage years attending math camp and programming computers for NASA. And then, on the other hand, you are a strong patient advocate, which is kind of counterintuitive. How do you bring those worlds together? Tell us about that, and how did you become Amy Abernathy that everybody gets inspiration from today in healthcare arena?
I'm honored by the question. As I think about the things that you just highlighted, I need to mention several things. In the way that you've just described it, I'm on my fourth career. I usually say I'm on my third career. And the reason is because my first career was as an oncologist and running a large research program at Duke, so in the academic setting. My second career was at Flatiron Health and running and helping to advance a health tech company. And then my third career now is at the FDA as a regulator. But my fourth career, as you just mentioned, was really my personal life, which included my time in math camp and my time working in the robotics and artificial intelligence lab at NASA, or really my time as a daughter who helped to take care of my father as he was dying of cancer, or really as a person, as a part of my family. And I say that because I think one of the things about my story, at least, is the blending of many different points of view that I have acquired over time doing all of these different jobs that helps me see the world hopefully in new and unique ways. And I think all of us bring new and unique lenses to the work that we do. And for me, that has ultimately led to being, as you pointed out, somebody very, very focused on the care of individual patients and the importance of the person at the center. That's just a byproduct of having spent so much time in the oncology clinic, but also so much time with my dad and as a part of my family. But at the same time that I am very focused on personhood and oncology, I'm also focused on the biology and the math and the development of the science and those start to come together so that my kind of overall approach to the world is patient centricity and precision medicine, but also the totality of the evidence and how do we do clinical trials, for example, better. But the other thing that all of these different careers and lenses have taught me is that you need to see where things are going. You need to see and identify the important problem to work on, but you can't just talk about it. You can't just write about it. You actually have to figure out how you're going to solve this. And so I've always thought that it's important to pair the vision of where things should go and a acute and clear description of that with the fundamentals of implementation and helping to get there. And really, the goal is to show how these two pieces come together. The last thing I would say is that I have learned a lot over my 4 careers about the importance of all of the voices and all of the lenses, that there isn't one single right most important point of view. So, when I was healthcare, it was often the physician point of view was dominant, or when I was in health tech, it was often the engineering point of view. But actually, the best answer is somewhere in the middle, and getting there requires understanding from all sides and being able to not only listen to each other, but find a linking language so that you can understand each other and find common solutions.
Amy,
Yeah.
switching back to the role of the agency, COVID-19 has necessitated FDA's regulatory flexibility. The public-private sector is working at unprecedented speed to develop therapeutics, diagnostics, vaccines. Can you help us understand what does the expedited process mean? And especially, what does it mean for the timing of a vaccine in the market?
So first I'll hit on expedited processes and sort of emergency use authorizations. And a public health emergency like this pandemic demands that we find ways to move quickly and that we essentially loosen some of the restrictions so that innovation and quick solutions can happen. Now, importantly, with those emergency use authorizations, we still also need to keep check on what's working well and what needs to be pulled back. And so you've seen as an agency that we've put forward emergency use authorizations in many different sectors, and sometimes we've had to pull them back. So as an example, we needed to adjust the emergency use authorizations for serology tests because we found that there were many serology tests hitting the market that just weren't performing. And so we needed to now adjust the information that needed to be delivered to the FDA in order to get authorization as a serology test on the market. And so in these emergency use authorizations, in these kinds of mechanisms, it isn't okay just to provide the regulatory flexibility. We still have to keep an assessment of what's going on across the different markets, the different industries that we regulate to help maintain safety and maintain public health. And that's one of the places where I see real world data having a huge role as to help to continue to monitor for safety and effectiveness after an emergency use authorization has been granted. We see also similar flexibility in, for example, the guidances that we put out that signal where we will be more flexible, more lenient in the context of the pandemic. And so that's one of the examples around how we have to adjust in dealing with the public health emergency and sort of this expedited scenario. You brought up something else that I think is really very interesting, which is how do we need to adjust in the context of, for example, the development of vaccines. Now, certainly as FDA, we have a critical role in regulating the vaccines that get developed. So evaluating them for safety and effectiveness and evaluating their use on the market. And that role will continue. But one of the things I find very interesting about the public health emergency and the critical question around the development of vaccines is that if we're going to do this quickly, we have to stop and rethink how we get from here to there. Typically in developing a medical product, There is the discovery phase, the clinical development phase when you do the clinical trials. Then there is the submission of information for regulatory review and approval. Now you go to manufacturing at scale and then distribution. So that there's those series of sequential steps. And certainly as we think about something like developing and distributing a vaccine at scale where the population needs it quickly, we can't skimp on steps such as thinking about safety, but what we can do is think about how these steps might be done in parallel. So the discovery and the clinical development ultimately happening in parallel with planning for the manufacturing and distribution. So that if we get to a place where there's been an approved vaccine, then we also get to a place where we've already figured out how we're going to manufacture it, how we're going to package it, how we're going to distribute it, so that those pieces have already been done.
Now, diversity in clinical trials has been a challenge typically. How do the FDA and NIH work together to ensure recruitment of diversity of all kinds in ramping up clinical trials for COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines both?
So this has been something that has personally been very important to me for more than 15 years, is how do we think about improving representation of people in clinical trials who are often underrepresented. This includes racial and minority backgrounds. It includes the older patient who's often underrepresented in clinical trials. It includes also people with illnesses that may be systematically excluded for reasons that don't make sense. And an example there is HIV. And so it has been an area of focus for FDA as well as for NIH to do several things. To, first of all, for example, on the FDA side, we had public meetings and listening sessions to identify and understand the problem better, and then have developed a series of guidances that highlight the importance of enrolling more diverse populations and also widening the eligibility criteria in clinical trials. On the NIH side, this has included mandated reporting, mandated activity within the context of clinical trials, and other policy initiatives that the NIH can push forward to try and drive it in the academic sector. Ultimately, we have to acknowledge that it is hard to change the distribution of the kind of people who are enrolled in clinical trials, and that takes real work. And it actually takes first identifying the problem and communicating about it clearly, and then thinking about policy levers, as well as practical levers that have got to do with activities directly in the clinic, such as how do you better communicate with patients? How do you make sure information is accessible? How do you talk to people who may ultimately not have the opportunity to have a dialogue with somebody who can put the information into a framing that is most accessible and makes sense? How can you change that so that you can make clinical trials more accessible and easier to understand for people of all kinds of different backgrounds?
I think the key here is that this is a hard problem to solve. And it's important for us to work together and try and solve it. It will take time, but we have to address it. Yeah. Amy, if you were queen for a day and could change anything in the US healthcare, what would be your top 3 changes?
If I were queen for a day and could change anything in your US healthcare, first of all, I like this idea. I think that the first thing I would change in US healthcare is I would think about how do you coordinate the different elements that we already have available in order to have them work more systematically together. And let me give you an example of what I mean. We've seen in this pandemic that we have the CDC, we have the NIH, we have FDA, we have other agencies as well as centralized federal and HHS activities. How do we better coordinate those activities so that we can work in as concerted as a fashion as possible? And we certainly are trying to, but we've got opportunities to be able to use more common data sources, We've got opportunities to be able to leverage lessons learned across these different agencies more quickly. So that's the first thing that I would change. I would make sure that there are trans HHS and really sort of trans governmental solutions that make it easy for those agencies to work together as efficiently as possible. And I'm a data file. I think you know that. So I think data is going to be one of the core solutions to making that happen. The second thing, if I was queen for a day, that I would change as it relates to healthcare is I would also similarly try and improve the coordination between what are the policy levers and the government levers we have and what can happen within the context of healthcare systems and clinics, so that we are thinking in a coordinated fashion about how do we learn as quickly as possible from every patient. It's really the learning health system model, but we have many more tools and solutions that we can bring to bear right now that we can now put together so that health systems, government, clinics, patients, patient advocacy groups can really start to work together within the context of building a learning healthcare system. So that would be number 2 on my list. And number 3 on my list, if I was queen for a day and was going to change healthcare, is I would help to figure out how do we reframe prevention and living well as a critical part of making sure we maintain health as Americans and figure out what's the right funding and policy strategy to push that forward.
Thank you, Amy, for spending your time with us. It was great to have you.
Great to be here, and I appreciate being asked, and I look forward to the questions.
Over to Paul.